January 17, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in silence, blanketing the frozen earth in a shroud of white that muffled the world. Through the skeletal trees, a column of German Panzer IV tanks crawled forward, their engines growling like wounded beasts in the bitter cold. Inside the lead tank, Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Müller pressed his face against the cold steel of the viewing port, his breath fogging the narrow slit. The forest stretched endlessly before him, dark, suffocating, hostile. He could feel the weight of the war pressing down on his shoulders, heavier than the iron coffin that surrounded him. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with sweat and gun oil, a familiar cocktail that had become the scent of survival. His crew said nothing. They had learned long ago that words were wasted in these moments when death could arrive without warning, without mercy. For 3.5 years, the panzer crews of the Wehrmacht had rolled across Europe with a confidence bordering on invincibility. They had crushed Poland in weeks, swept through France in a campaign that stunned the world, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union with an arrogance that seemed justified by their armoured might. The panzer had become more than a weapon. It had become a symbol of German superiority, a steel incarnation of blitzkrieg doctrine. These were not mere soldiers. They were the elite, the arm of the military that had redefined modern warfare. They had been taught that armour was king, that the thickness of their steel and the power of their guns made them untouchable by infantry. A man on foot was nothing before a tank, a rabbit before a wolf. But in the winter of 1945, in the dying gasps of the Ardennes offensive, that certainty had begun to crack. Heinrich had heard the rumours whispered in the repair depots and field hospitals, stories that seemed impossible, almost laughable. American infantrymen, ordinary foot soldiers armed with nothing but tubes, destroying panzers with single shots. At first, he had dismissed them as propaganda, the desperate lies of a beaten enemy trying to boost morale. How could a man standing in the open, exposed and vulnerable, threaten 30 tons of German steel? The very idea violated everything he had been trained to believe. Anti-tank rifles barely scratched paint. Grenades were suicidal gamble. The infantry's only real hope against armour had always been artillery or another tank. Yet the rumours persisted, growing darker with each telling. The Americans called it the bazooka. The name itself sounded absurd, like something from a comedian's routine rather than a weapon of war. Heinrich had learned it was named after a musical instrument, a ridiculous horn played by some American entertainer before the war. What kind of nation named its weapons after jokes? What kind of soldier would carry something so undignified into battle? The Germans had their own shape-charge weapons, the Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust, but these had been developed as desperate responses to Soviet tank superiority on the Eastern Front. They were tools of necessity, born from losing rather than winning. The Americans, Heinrich thought, should still be learning. They should still be afraid. His tank lurched forward, tracks biting into frozen mud. The forest pressed closer. In a foxhole 300 metres ahead, Private First Class Robert Chen crouched in the snow, his fingers numb despite the wool gloves. The Monet 1 bazooka rested across his knees, the long tube cold enough to burn exposed skin. His loader, a kid from Nebraska named Willis, huddled beside him with the rockets cradled in his arms like newborns. They had been here for 2 hours, waiting, watching the tree line for the rumble they knew was coming. Chen had fired the bazooka exactly 3 times in combat. The first shot had missed completely, sailing high over a Panther tank and exploding harmlessly in a stone wall. The second had struck a half-track, turning it into a fireball that cooked off ammunition for 20 minutes. The third had hit a Panzer Ford in the turret ring, and Chen had watched through the smoke as the crew burned. He tried not to think about that one. The bazooka weighed 13 pounds unloaded, just over 20 with a rocket chambered. It was simple, almost crude, in its design. A 60-inch steel tube, open at both ends, with a wooden stock and pistol grip. The rocket itself was a 2.5-pound shaped charge that looked like a small bomb with fins. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. Fire a rocket that would penetrate armour not through kinetic force, but through focused heat and pressure. The shaped charge would create a superplastic jet of molten metal capable of burning through steel plate at temperatures exceeding 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was physics weaponized, chemistry turned lethal. When the first bazookas arrived in North Africa in 1942, Even American tankers had been skeptical. How could something so light, so portable, threaten real armour? The German tanks in Tunisia had thin plates, early models, and still the bazooka's effectiveness had been inconsistent. But by 1944, as American industry refined the design and increased production, the weapon had evolved. The M9A1 model addressed the early issues: better rockets, improved sights, more reliable ignition. And most importantly, American troops learned where to aim. Not at the thickest frontal armour, but at the sides, the rear, the hatches, the weak points that every tank possessed but doctrine taught to protect. The rumble grew louder. Chen's pulse quickened. Heinrich saw the movement a fraction too late, a flash of motion in the trees there and gone. He opened his mouth to warn the gunner, but the world exploded before the words could form. A streak of fire crossed the distance between forest and tank, moving faster than thought, and struck the Panzer's side armour just below the turret. The impact sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil, a sharp metallic crack that echoed inside the crew compartment. Then came the heat. The shaped charge detonated on contact, focusing its explosive force into a pencil-thin jet that burned through the hardened steel plate in microseconds. The jet temperature reached nearly 6,000 degrees, hot enough to melt tungsten, to vaporize iron. The armour didn't shatter or crack. It simply ceased to exist in that narrow cone of superheated destruction. The jet punched through 45 millimeters of steel as easily as a needle through fabric, carrying with it a spray of molten metal fragments that ignited everything they touched inside the crew compartment. The ammunition stored below the turret cooked off instantly. Secondary explosions tore through the tank's interior with savage efficiency, turning the crew space into a blast furnace. Heinrich felt the heat before the pain, a searing wave that consumed the air in his lungs. He tried to scream, but there was no air left to scream with. The world became fire and pressure and noise beyond comprehension. The hatch above him had been closed, locked for protection, and now that protection became a tomb. The steel that had promised safety was now the conductor of agony, heating to temperatures that blistered skin on contact. Outside, Chen lowered the bazooka, his ears ringing from the backblast. Willis was already loading another rocket, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the shaking. The German tank had stopped moving. Thick black smoke poured from every opening, hatches, vision ports, the turret ring. Flames licked from the engine compartment. Chen waited, watching for crew to bail out, but no one emerged. No one ever did when the ammunition cooked off. The second tank in the column reversed frantically, its commander having seen what happened to the lead panzer. But the forest had more foxholes, more teams with bazookas. Another rocket streaked from a different angle, striking the reversing tank in its thinner rear armour. The result was the same: penetration, ignition, catastrophic kill. Within 90 seconds, two 30-ton tanks had been reduced to burning wrecks by two men armed with weapons they could carry on their shoulders. This was the nightmare that German tankers had not been prepared for. This was the weapon that textbooks and training had never adequately addressed. The Wehrmacht's tactical doctrine assumed armour superiority, assumed that infantry would require heavy weapons, anti-tank guns weighing hundreds of pounds, towed by vehicles and crewed by specialists. The bazooka rendered those assumptions obsolete. It democratized tank destruction, putting lethal capability into the hands of ordinary infantrymen who could hide anywhere, strike from any angle, and disappear before retaliation arrived. The psychological impact was perhaps more devastating than the physical destruction. A panzer crew could rationalize being destroyed by another tank. That was combat between equals, warfare as they understood it. They could accept artillery, those distant guns they never saw but knew were out there. But to be killed by a lone infantryman, by a soldier they had been trained to see as inferior, by a weapon so simple a conscript could learn to fire it in an afternoon, that was terror of a different kind. It inverted the natural order of the battlefield. It made the hunters into the hunted. In the weeks following the initial encounters with bazookas in Europe, German after-action reports reflected a growing anxiety. Panzer commanders reported their crews were jumpy, overcautious, reluctant to advance through terrain that might hide infantry. The psychological doctrine of armoured warfare, the idea that tanks created fear and infantry fled before them, had been reversed. Now it was the tanks that feared, that hesitated, that looked at every window and tree line as a potential death sentence. The report spoke clinically of morale degradation and combat effectiveness reduction, but the underlying message was clear: their men were terrified. The Americans, with their industrial abundance and pragmatic engineering, had created something the Germans had not anticipated, a weapon that matched their ideology. It was democratic in its lethality, simple enough for citizens in uniform rather than professional soldiers. It required no aristocracy of skill, no years of training. 2 weeks of instruction and a steady nerve were sufficient. In that simplicity lay a profound statement about the American way of war. Mass production of adequate solutions distributed widely, rather than small numbers of excellent solutions concentrated among elite units. By January 1945, over 400,000 bazookas had been manufactured. They equipped virtually every American infantry company in Europe. The weapon had become as standard as the Mohn rifle, as ubiquitous as the entrenching tool, and unlike German shape-charge weapons, which were often in short supply due to resource constraints and production bottlenecks, American logistics ensured rockets arrived in abundance. Frontline units reported having more bazooka ammunition than they could reasonably carry, a situation unthinkable in the resource-starved Wehrmacht. The bazooka became a symbol, though few recognized it as such in the moment. It represented American material superiority translated into tactical flexibility. While German engineers designed increasingly heavy tanks with thicker armor, the Panther, the Tiger, the monstrous King Tiger, American factories produced weapons that made armor thickness less relevant. The equation of tank warfare was changing. It no longer mattered how thick your steel was if the enemy could strike from any direction with weapons that burned through regardless. The race for heavier armor was becoming obsolete even as Germany poured resources into it. For the soldiers who carried the bazooka, the weapon was both liberating and terrifying. It gave infantrymen power they had never possessed before, the ability to stand against the machines that had dominated battlefields for years. But with that power came vulnerability. The backblast announced your position to every enemy within 500 meters. The flash of firing drew every gun toward you, and reloading took precious seconds, during which you were completely exposed. Bazooka teams had life expectancies measured in minutes once they revealed themselves. They knew this. They fired anyway. Chen and Willis stayed in their foxhole for another 10 minutes, watching the burning tanks. Other vehicles in the German column had retreated, pulling back into the forest rather than face an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't effectively counter. It was a small victory in a much larger battle, one engagement among thousands, but it was repeated across every front where American infantry met German armor. The pattern was consistent: surprise, penetration, destruction, withdrawal. The bazookas were rewriting the calculus of armored warfare, one burning tank at a time. In the years after the war, military historians would analyze the bazooka's impact with academic detachment, discussing penetration values and tactical employment doctrine. But for the men who faced it and the men who fired it, the weapon was something more visceral. It was proof that technology could be democratized, that lethality could be portable, that the individual soldier mattered in an age of industrial warfare. The German tankers who survived encounters with bazookas carried psychological scars that matched their physical wounds, a permanent knowledge that armor was no longer absolute protection, that any shadow might conceal instant death. The snow continued falling on that January afternoon, covering the burned-out panzers in a gentle blanket of white that seemed almost merciful. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, and the war continued its grinding advance toward inevitable conclusion. But in that frozen forest, in those moments of fire and terror, a fundamental truth had been demonstrated. Superiority in war belongs not always to the strongest or the best trained, but sometimes simply to those who can deliver effective violence more reliably, more abundantly, more democratically than their enemy. The bazooka was not an elegant weapon. It was not sophisticated.